USS Maryland, or BB-46, was a Colorado-class battleship. Nicknamed Old Mary or Fighting Mary, design work on this latest type of battleship was completed in 1916, and the Colorados were basically direct copies of the preceding Tennessee class, except that their main battery had been switched from 12 14-inch guns to 8 16-inch guns. The Colorados would also be the last class of battleships completed of the standard types. And despite being named the Colorado class after USS Colorado, Maryland was actually the oldest of the ships, being laid down first on April 24, 1917, and commissioned first on July 21, 1921. USS Colorado wouldn't actually be commissioned until August 30th, 1923, and she would be followed up by the baby of the family, USS West Virginia, on the 1st of December, 1923. There was actually supposed to be a fourth one, USS Washington, or BB-47, but she was cancelled when she was over 75% complete due to the Washington Naval Treaty that limited naval armaments, making it so that the Colorado class would always be a total of 3 ships. And for Maryland's part, being technically the oldest sister, she was 624 feet, or 190 meters, long overall, and she had a beam of 97 feet 6 inches, or 29.72 meters, as well as a draft of 30 feet 6 inches, or 9.30 meters. As designed, she displaced 33,218 tons, and at full load, she would hit 34,130 tons. She got her power from 4 General Electric turbo-electric drives with steam provided by 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers. Her power output was rated at about 28,900 horsepower, and she could hit a top speed of 21 knots. That's 24 miles per hour or 39 kilometers per hour. Though on her speed trials, she actually exceeded this by just a little bit, hitting 21.09 knots. Her normal cruising range was roughly 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, but she had onboard space that could be used to store extra fuel, and that could increase her range to 21,100 nautical miles, a huge boost. Her crew complement consisted of 64 officers and 1,241 enlisted men. She was armed with a battery of 8 16-inch guns, in 4 twin turrets on the center line, 2 forward and 2 aft. Her secondary battery was made up of 16 5-inch guns that were mounted individually in casemates clustered in the superstructure amidships. She also carried an anti-aircraft battery of 8 3-inch guns in individual high-angle mounts. And going along with the practice of the period, she actually had torpedo tubes mounted in her hull below the waterline on each broadside. Her main armor belt was between 8 to 13.5 inches thick, and her main armor deck was up to 3.5 inches thick. Maryland wasn't even commissioned till after World War I, so naturally she didn't take part in that, and would enter service during the interwar period, or when it comes to warships, the period of boredom. There really wasn't much to do, as I've repeatedly stated, and I'm going to keep saying it every time, just so we're clear. When she was commissioned, she undertook an East Coast shakedown cruise, and after that she was actually made a flagship of Admiral Hilary P. Jones. As she was a new ship, she was in great demand for special occasions. She appeared at Annapolis, Maryland for the 1922 United States Naval Academy graduation, and at Boston, Massachusetts for the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the 4th of July. From the 18th of August to the 25th of September, she paid her first visit to a foreign port, as she was transporting the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, to Rio de Janeiro for Brazil's Centennial Exposition. And the following year, after she did some fleet exercises off the Panama Canal Zone, Maryland passed through the canal in the latter part of June to join the battle fleet that was stationed on the west coast. She remained a flagship until 1923, when that role was given over to USS Pennsylvania. She would also travel to another foreign port in 1925, when she was in Australia and New Zealand. In 1928, she actually transported the president-elect, Herbert Hoover, on the Pacific leg of his tour of Latin America. She would wind up receiving an overhaul between 1928 and 1929, and the 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced by 8 5-inch guns. Throughout the 1930s, she basically participated in pretty much every fleet training operation you could possibly imagine. That's really what she did. That's all she did, because there was nothing else to do. And she conducted numerous patrols as well. In 1940, Maryland's base of operations was switched to Pearl Harbor, and she was indeed present at Battleship Row on December 7th, 1941. When the Japanese descended on the harbor, Maryland was in a rather awkward position that was both a blessing and a curse. See, she was completely unable to maneuver in any way, which most of the battleships were in that position, but she was right next to Oklahoma. Her little sister West Virginia was also nearby, and Tennessee was right behind her. California was to her front. And while she couldn't move, this also meant that it was extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible, for the Japanese to get any torpedo hits on Maryland. Which is exactly what happened. She was never hit by any torpedoes because Oklahoma protected her. As we discussed last week, Oklahoma would not survive the attack on Pearl Harbor, but her death did wind up protecting USS Maryland. At the time of the attack, Maryland's crew was actually preparing for shore leave, scheduled for 9 o'clock. Some of them were eating breakfast. Seaman Leslie Short, who had actually been in the middle of addressing Christmas cards while sitting near his machine gun, was one of the first ones to fire back that day, and he would wind up shooting down one of the torpedo bombers that had attacked USS Oklahoma. And due to the protection afforded to her, Maryland was able to get all her anti-aircraft batteries into action. And Maryland's crew would wind up receiving extra help, as when Oklahoma capsized, a lot of her crew jumped over to Maryland and began assisting however they could to continue the fight. Maryland did not get away unscathed, however. She was hit by 2 armor-piercing bombs, which detonated pretty low on her hull. The first had struck the forecastle awning and made a hole that was about 12 feet by 20 feet in size. The second exploded after entering the hull at around frame 10. This second hit did cause flooding and increased Maryland's draft forward by about 5 feet, but it wasn't enough to bring her down. She continued firing, and after the attack was over, she sent firefighting parties to assist her fellow battleships. This included saving trapped men from USS Oklahoma, as well as attempted to help her very badly damaged little sister, USS West Virginia. West Virginia would eventually return to service, but only after several years. Maryland didn't have to watch her sister die necessarily, but she did watch her get gravely injured, and she watched her cousin Oklahoma sacrifice herself so that she, Fighting Mary, could live. In total, on board USS Maryland, 2 officers and 2 men were killed in the attack. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese actually announced that Maryland had been sunk, though obviously this wasn't true at all. On the 30th of December, Maryland entered the Puget Sound Navy Yard for repairs, just behind USS Tennessee, who had also gotten out of Pearl Harbor relatively unscathed as she was protected by USS West Virginia. 2 of Maryland's original 12 5-inch guns were removed, and her 25 caliber guns were actually replaced by an equal number of 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. The repairs also consisted of an overhaul that took place over the course of 2 months, so Maryland could receive new equipment to prepare her for the war to come. She was finished by February 26, 1942, and then she underwent a series of shakedowns, being sent back into action in June. She was the second battleship damaged at Pearl Harbor to return to duty. Her first actions during the war consisted of a supporting role during the Battle of Midway, though that particular fight was mostly won by the aircraft carriers. The battleships really had not much to do with that, and Maryland's role consisted of patrolling with a backup fleet that was tasked with protecting the west coast. She was on call just in case that whole time, but she was never needed, and when the Battle of Midway was over, Maryland was then sent to San Francisco. Once there, she began a series of nearly constant training exercises with Battleship Division 2, 3, and 4 until August 1st, when she would return to Pearl Harbor for some repairs, which was the first time she was back there since the attack. That done, she would leave the harbor in early November alongside her sister Colorado, and she would wind up steaming for the Fiji Islands. Her and Colorado acted as the meanest of guard dogs to deter the Japanese from advancing on that particular area, keeping them away from Australia. They both conducted frequent sweeps for Japanese forces, and in early 1943, following the success of the Solomon Islands campaign, the strategy of the Allies shifted from defense to offense. In February, both Maryland and Colorado moved to New Hebrides, a location that proved unbearably hot, much to her crew's annoyance. She then moved to Espiritu Santo, again acting as a guard, but it was also very hot there, and there were heavy rains in the area. Eventually, she would head back to Pearl Harbor again for a 5-week overhaul, where she was given more anti-aircraft guns on her top decks and foremast. She left on October 20th, 1943, heading for the South Pacific, and she was made flagship of Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill's 5th Amphibious Force and Southern Attack Force in the Gilbert Islands invasion. Also aboard Maryland were both Major General Julian C. Smith, who was commander of the 2nd Marine Division, and Colonel Evans Carlson, who was commander of Carlson's Raiders. They were gearing up for an assault on Tarawa. The battle would commence on November 20th, and mark Maryland's first offensive action of the war. Her guns opened fire at 5 a.m. and crushed a shore battery within 5 salvos on the southwestern point of Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. At 6 a.m., she then commenced a scheduled shore bombardment to soften up defenses ahead of the landings, and she actually moved closer to shore to attract Japanese fire so they could locate artillery emplacements and silence them. By 9 a.m., Marine landing forces were encountering heavy Japanese resistance and began seeing casualties. Maryland was called to provide covering fire and eliminate several Japanese machine gun nests. Her own scouting plane then began to cover the progress of the Marines' assault, along with Maryland's continued artillery support. The plane would wind up being damaged, and the pilot was wounded in action. Maryland covered the offensive on Betio Island for 3 days before she moved to Apamama Island to guard Marine landings over there. There was only light resistance, however, on that island, with only 30 Japanese soldiers to contend with, and 2 prisoners were taken and brought aboard Maryland. On December 7th, Maryland left Apamama to return to Pearl Harbor, stopping there only briefly before leaving for San Francisco for some repairs. Maryland left California on January 13th, 1944, and would wind up rendezvousing with Task Force 53 for 2 days of loading ammunition. Oh, it's very USS Pennsylvania of you. It wasn't just ammo, they loaded fuel and food as well, but this was being done ahead of a new operation that was supporting the Marshall Islands campaign. On January 30th, she moved to support landings on Roy Island. In the early morning of January 31st, Maryland and the other ships began a bombardment of the Kwajalein Atoll, starting the Battle of Kwajalein. Maryland herself would be responsible for destroying numerous Japanese stationary guns as well as pillboxes, and she would actually fire her guns so much that she split the liners of turret number 1, which put it out of action for the rest of the day. She continued her attack on February 1st as U.S. landing forces moved forward, and she became the flagship for Admiral Connolly for the next 2 weeks. In addition to firing just so much, she also ran around and resupplied many of the smaller ships in the operation until she left with a task unit of carriers and destroyers on February 15th, steaming to Bremerton Navy Yard, where she received yet another overhaul and her guns, which again, she broke from shooting so much, were replaced. On May 5th, Maryland sailed westward to join Task Force 52, which was headed for Saipan. Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner wanted the task force to take 3 days to soften up the island's defenses ahead of the assault, and firing commenced at 5:45 a.m. on June 14th. Maryland, alongside other ships including USS Pennsylvania, helped soften up defenses quite a bit, and the invasion commenced on June 15th, with Maryland continued to provide fire support for landing forces. The battleships were so effective at this that the Japanese attempted to counter them through an air attack. On June 18th, Maryland shot down her first Japanese planes, but on June 22nd, a single Mitsubishi G4M3 Betty bomber was flying low over the Saipan Hills that were still contested when she stumbled upon both Maryland and Pennsylvania. The plane dropped a torpedo, which slammed into Maryland and blew a large hole in her starboard bow. The explosion resulted in light casualties, but the flooding was controlled very quickly. In 15 minutes, she was underway again and limped back to Pearl Harbor, going in reverse the whole time to avoid doing further damage to her bow. She was escorted by 2 destroyers during this, and she lost 2 men in the attack. The shipyard workers worked day and night to repair Maryland at Pearl, and she was back up and running in just 34 days, departing on August 13th. She headed for the Solomon Islands with a large task force and anchored in Purvis Bay off Florida Island for 2 weeks, before she steamed for the Palaeo Islands on September 6th. She then joined Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's Western Fire Support Group, and on September 12th she covered mine-sweeping operations as well as underwater demolition teams at the opening of the Battle of Peleliu. She again conducted shore bombardments during this time to support the landing craft as they approached the beaches on September 15th. The fighting was over 4 days later, which allowed Maryland to leave the area and head back to the Admiralty Islands by the end of the month. In early October, she was assigned to the 7th Fleet under Admiral Kincaid, and they sortied on the 12th of October. Maryland joined Task Group 77.2, which consisted of other battleships, including her newly repaired little sister, USS West Virginia, who had been given many upgrades and was looking for a fight. Sister, it's so good to see you, but you seem different. Oh, I am different, Maryland. I am so very different. What did they do to fix you? They made me stronger. The task group headed into Leyte Gulf on the morning of October 18th, and Maryland took up her position between red and white beaches, beginning bombardment ahead of the invasion, which started at 10 a.m. on October 20th. The beaches were secured very quickly, and then Maryland took up a different position in Leyte Gulf to guard the beaches against a Japanese counterattack by sea. Over the next several days, the Japanese launched many air raids to counter the incursion, and that included the first widespread use of kamikaze attacks. Several days into this, U.S. submarines in the South China Sea wound up spotting 2 Japanese forces on approach. This included 5 battleships steaming towards San Bernardino Strait, and another force of 4 Japanese carriers in northern Luzon. On October 24th, Maryland, West Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania sailed to the southern end of Leyte Gulf to protect the Surigao Strait, along with several cruisers, destroyers, and PT boats. On October 25th, well, it was during the Battle of Surigao Strait. We went over this when we talked about USS Pennsylvania, as well as USS West Virginia. The Japanese fleet, which included battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, led the Japanese advance into the strait, but the American forces had crossed the T, allowing for full broadsides from the battleships. They launched an ambush, which was headed off by USS West Virginia and her more advanced radar set, that allowed her to strike her targets on her first salvo. Phoebe, you can stop now. I think they're dead already.
They're never dead enough!
Phoebe, please,
Let these people burn!
Torpedoes from the destroyers wound up sinking Fuso, and continued attacks by the task force also claimed Yamashiro, with the rest of the Japanese forces retreating while being pursued by Allied aircraft. It was a great victory for the Allies, and the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Once that was done, Maryland patrolled on the southern approaches to Surrey Strait until October 29th, when she then steamed for the Admiralty Isles for brief replenishment, and then resumed patrol duty around Leyte on November 16th, where she protected landing forces from continued air attacks. On November 29th, a kamikaze aircraft actually caught Maryland a bit by surprise and managed to hit her. This aircraft crashed into Maryland between turrets number 1 and 2, piercing the forecastle, main, and armored decks, as well as blowing a hole in the 4-inch steel. This caused extensive damage and started fires. 31 men were killed, and 30 were wounded in this attack, which also happened to destroy the medical department, though they were still able to use it to render first aid where needed. Despite the damage, Maryland stayed on task until December 2nd, when she was relieved of her duties, after which she sailed back to Pearl for repairs and arrived there on December 18th. She was fixed up and refitted over the next few months. She steamed for the Western Pacific on March 4th, 1945, arriving at Ulithi on March 16th. There, she would wind up joining the 5th Fleet and Rear Admiral Morton Deo's Task Force 54, which was preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. The fleet departed on March 21st. Maryland specifically was assigned targets on the southern coast of Okinawa to support a diversionary landing, which is a part of a strategy to distract Japanese forces away from the main landing on the west coast. The Japanese responded with several air raids, and 2 of Maryland's radar picket destroyers were struck by kamikaze planes, one of which, USS Luce, sank. On April 3rd, Maryland was moved to the west coast invasion beaches to assist the cruiser Minneapolis in destroying several shore batteries. Following the land invasion, she remained on station to support the force off Bolo Point, with further artillery barrages on request. She remained on fire support duty until April 7th, when she then steamed north to intercept a Japanese surface force. Those ships, which included the famous Yamato, would wind up being ripped apart by US air attacks that same day. Planes would sink 6 of the 10 ships, so Maryland never got involved in this particular fight. At dusk, a kamikaze that was loaded with a 551-pound bomb crashed into Maryland, striking the top of turret number 3 from the starboard side. This explosion completely destroyed the 20mm mounts and caused a very large fire. The ammunition there ignited from the heat, and that caused further casualties. 10 men were killed, with 37 being injured and 6 missing. Maryland still stubbornly remained on station for the next week to continue her artillery support, while facing off against several more air raids. Fighting Mary's a stubborn old girl, isn't she? Turret number 3 was technically usable, but given the damage, they chose to keep it silent for the remainder of the mission. On April 14th, Maryland finally left the firing line at Okinawa and escorted several retiring transports. They wound up steaming via the Mariana Islands and Guam back to Pearl Harbor, and then she reached the Puget Sound Navy Yard at Bremerton on May 7th for a very extensive overhaul. All of her 5-inch guns were removed and replaced by 16 5-inch guns in new twin mounts. The light anti-aircraft armament was revised heavily to 40 Bofors 40mm guns in 10 quad mounts and 36 Oerlikon 20mm guns in 18 dual mounts. Although a different source actually states that Maryland had 44 40mm guns in 11 quad mounts and 44 20mm and 20 twin and a single quad mount. So there's some dispute over how many anti-aircraft guns she had, but she had a lot of them, I think is really where we're at with it. Her armored conning tower was also removed and replaced by a very similar but lighter STS structure, with only 1.2 inches of armor to compensate for the extra weight that was gained during this particular refit. All those extra guns, as it turns out, were very, very heavy. Extra protection was added over the magazines, and turret top armor was raised to 7 inches. New double-layered anti-torpedo bulges were installed, which, while that was good for anti-torpedo purposes, also had a secondary purpose in the form of increasing the armored freeboard to again compensate for Maryland's increase in weight. She also received an SK-2 radar in place of her previous SK, and her main battery received new Mark 13 radars for fire control. Turret number 3 was also repaired, and crew quarters were even improved. These new modifications would make her mean as all heck, but well, I was about to say unfortunately, but I guess it's technically a good thing in the grand scheme of things. Maryland wouldn't be finished until August, and she left for her test runs just as Japan surrendered. And with the end of World War II, she would never have to use any of her new equipment. With the ceasing of hostilities, Maryland was now relegated to basically transport duty, joining the Operation Magic Carpet Fleet, which was a post-World War II operation to bring American military personnel home. During the remaining months of 1945, Maryland made 5 different voyages between the West Coast and Pearl Harbor, personally returning more than 8,000 servicemen to the United States. She arrived from her last voyage as a part of this operation in Seattle, Washington on December 17th, and she would enter Puget Sound Naval Shipyard on April 15th, 1946, to be placed in commission in inactive reserve on July 16th. She was officially decommissioned at Bremerton on April 3rd, 1947, but she was not scrapped immediately. She stayed there as a unit of the Pacific Reserve Fleet for over 10 years. Eventually, though, it was decided that all the Colorados would never need to be used again, and Maryland was sold for scrap to Lerner Company of Oakland, California on July 8th, 1959. There wasn't much of her left remaining after that, but on June 2nd, 1961, the then governor of Maryland, J. Millard Tawes, dedicated a monument to the memory of USS Maryland and her crew. It's built of granite and bronze and incorporates Maryland's bell. That monument is located on the grounds of the State House in Annapolis. USS Maryland's story is one of steadfast dedication. She was forced to sit and watch at Pearl Harbor, trying to fight back to protect her fellow battleships, but then watched her cousin die for her, and her little sister be gravely wounded. But Maryland kept up the fight, and even when she took hits herself, she still stayed in it. And for that, she should always be remembered. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, SomeDude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Lord R444, Mark Holding, Murder Drones Doll, A-Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso La Puche, Royal Hunter 2860, Iserfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Prez Drenton, Bradley Bowden, Dr. Racer 78, and Josh Johnson. Till next time, this is Darkness to the Beach Wall of Fun. Farewell.